Well, hello, everyone. My name is Betty Pluis, and I'm a member of the Climate Legacy Steering Committee. I'm joining you today from Carp, Ontario, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I want to welcome you to today's webinar on behalf of Climate Legacy and the Group of 78. Climate Legacy works to engage more seniors in climate action, and the Group of 78 is a civil society organization to promote Canadian and global action for peace and disarmament and equitable and sustainable development. Today's webinar, Climate Close to Home, focuses on climate adaptation and municipalities. It's the fifth in our series, Financing the Transition to a Net Zero Carbon Economy, and you can view the earlier webinars on our website. I am delighted to introduce Catherine McKenney, who will moderate today's session. Catherine is a former Ottawa City Councillor, well known for their action on municipal issues such as housing and homelessness, climate, and transportation. They are now the Executive Director of CitySHAPES, which is a nonprofit dedicated to building better cities. We are also very pleased to have Donna Shirelli from the Natural Assets Initiative and Dustin Carey from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Betty, and welcome everyone. That's quite the list of people who have joined us, many familiar names, others I don't know personally, but certainly I see many from across the country even, so excellent. Really looking forward to this. I'm really excited to moderate today's discussion, how municipalities can lead the way to greener, more resilient cities and towns. And first, we just have to say that we just no longer can have a serious discussion about climate change without mentioning the devastating impacts of climate change on many parts of our country and other countries. This past summer, the hundreds of wildfires burning out of control, forcing evacuations of entire cities and burning entire communities. We've had, devastating floods in cities across the country that took some lives and quite unfortunately caused significant damage to our homes, our infrastructure, heat domes, tornadoes on a weekly basis. The list just goes on, and it is municipalities, whether they're small, medium, or large, who are at the front lines. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of people from different municipalities here today. It's our residents who are impacted and who will continue to be responsible for the ongoing cost of these disasters. So, we know that a lot of activism, whether it's for housing or transportation or climate, often focuses on federal and provincial levels of government, but we need to look at municipalities who play a key role. So, and of course, I'm also excited because I get the opportunity to work with two people whose careers I've followed on social media and elsewhere, to say during my time at City of Ottawa as both staff and an elected official. I often look to others for guidance and expertise in making difficult decisions. Fortunately, for us, those of us who, we don't have expertise in everything, but we do have people like our two guests here today that provide that knowledge. So I'm going to quickly introduce, we have Donna Shirelli. Donna is a core team member of Natural Assets Initiative, working on multiple projects to support communities across Canada to integrate natural asset management and nature-based solutions into their infrastructure management and service delivery. We're going to hear more about that. Donna's got present some slides, but we will get more into the work that she does. And also we have Dustin Carey, who's the lead of climate adaptation with FCM's Green Municipal Fund and an expert consultant with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So those are the experts that we have with us today. A couple of the experts that I certainly paid attention to at my time at the city. So we're going to get right into our webinar. Again, we often think about cities and we think about mitigation. We don't always think about adaptation, but that's why we're here today. So we're going to start off with Donna, and I think, Donna, you have some slides for this first question. Just talk about how cities can adapt to climate change, and what are some of the key steps that cities need to take to be able to adapt to what is already a changed climate?
Thanks very much, Catherine, and also thank you, Betty, for inviting me to speak today. I do have some knowledge about this. I'm sure many people at the webinar today have equally relevant knowledge and expertise. So also looking forward to hearing your questions and input as well throughout the webinar. What I wanted to do was just, kind of put the webinar in context. It is focused on adaptation and what we can do to adapt to climate change. But I think it's also really important to emphasize that adaptation is critical, but adaptation is going to be impossible without a rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we really do have to be thinking about both and be very strategic about the decisions and actions that we're taking at the local level. This is just an example of, what a top priority and concern it is right now. So this is and as you can see, like right now, currently, there's a lot of risks and concerns that are top of mind for people. I'm not sure if I'm freezing. Did I just freeze there for a second?
For a moment.
Okay, sorry, my connection seems to be unstable. So, but in any case, if you look at the short term, some of the top concerns are related to the cost of living crisis, extremely important, geoeconomic confrontation and conflict, natural disasters and extreme weather. If we look to sort of like what we think might be some of the biggest concerns and risks that we need to deal with, even just 10 years from now, that changes. Failure to mitigate climate change is really the top risk on people's minds in terms of how it's going to impact people around the world and our quality of life. And then failure to adapt to climate change is number 2. Related to those things, natural disasters and extreme weather events and biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. Sounds very grim, but anyways, like these are really top of mind in the near future in terms of the risks that we're going to be facing. So we do need to put that in context. So I just wanted to highlight, I think what's a really good concept that came out of the Adaptation to Climate Change team out of Simon Fraser University. A few years ago, I can't remember how many years ago, they came out with this report, but really wanted to highlight that we need to focus on low carbon resilience in order to sort of help meet some of today's challenges related to climate change and biodiversity loss. So what that means is really focusing investments and actions that consider both climate mitigation and adaptation goals. So that really means that in all decisions and actions that we're taking, and this is really relevant for local governments, but all governments as well, is that, for every decision we make, thinking about how will that decision manage risk? So how is it going to manage risks to the community vulnerabilities, to projected changes in our climate that are coming our way? The second is it going to help reduce emissions, by the local government itself or community-wide? So yes, a lot of emissions are happening, in municipalities, but it's not municipalities alone that are directly responsible for them. Climate action is all about community-wide action at the local level, some of which can be done by local governments themselves, and some of which really need to be done by others living in the local government. And then the third is, will this decision also deliver co-benefits to the community to advance community goals such as health, equity, biodiversity, economic savings and development? resources. So if we are really being strategic about trying to adapt to climate change and protect communities, we also really need to be thinking about that equity lens and how to protect the most vulnerable people in our communities. So I just thought it was important to highlight that because we need to be thinking about how we can be working on both mitigation and adaptation. And obviously we also need to ramp up our investments in adaptation as well, though. And then the last thing I wanted to say before turning it over to Dustin is just here's an example of what we mean by, you know, that interaction between adaptation actions and mitigation actions. So this slide comes from the town of Pelham's Corporate Climate Adaptation Plan. And so basically, the town of Pelham's done quite a bit of work to understand what the key risks and vulnerabilities are to climate change that are coming its way. So Pelham is a small community in Ontario. So, you know, you can see at the center of the Venn diagram, there are a number of actions that they've identified that are going to both support adaptation and mitigation. So by mitigation, we mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so they've identified things like focusing investments in local food or supporting local food, expanding and enhancing their tree canopy, you know, providing shade programs, insulating their buildings, which reduce energy, but also can help to protect people from extreme heat, that kind of thing. And then we have the actions on either side, which are more focused specifically on adaptation, like how are we going to help to build resilience to those climate change impacts that are coming our way. So that might be related to kind of upgrading our infrastructure and that kind of thing. And then on the mitigation side, we have all of the things that can also promote, you know, sustainable communities that are more equitable. So things like active transportation, you know, those kinds of things, and all the other things that we can do to reduce our energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, transit, that kind of thing. So, I just wanted to point those out, and also I just wanted to mention that the town of Pelham's actions really focus on 5 main categories, and I think these are important to keep in mind in terms of what local governments can do. And so those big kind of buckets of actions are: 1, increasing public awareness of the changing climate and its projected impacts. Public awareness and engagement is really critical, because the things that we do that the local governments can influence but can't do directly. You know, increase technical capacity to better manage the impacts. So that's something that local governments can do themselves. Mainstreaming climate change planning into all of their policy and investment decisions. So again, looking at that climate lens that I showed you earlier in terms of low carbon resilience. Increasing the adaptive capacity of built natural and human systems. And then the last one is strengthening community partnerships to increase resiliency in the community actions. So those partnerships are really going to be critical to be able to effectively adapt. So I've got lots of other examples, and we can look at some of the nature-based solutions later, but I think that's enough for me right now. And maybe now I'll turn it over to Dustin to give some examples.
Thanks, Donna. And yeah, I want to start by just really building on one point Catherine brought up, that for a long time, they're right, we didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the climate resiliency and adaptation space. When the climate change discussion started becoming more mainstream, start of the United Nations Conference of Parties, for instance, adaptation was really the ugly stepchild of the conversation. Didn't really want to acknowledge it because it was seen as a little bit of a failure of, if it was being discussed of adapting, attention was being taken away from the mitigation. It was almost an admission of failure. But that conversation might have had some value in the late 1980s, early 90s, but when climate change was very much more seen as a future-oriented problem, but we are living in a changed climate now. And as we're thinking through investments, infrastructure, building out communities, decisions that are going to have implications and footprints for decades or centuries from now, it's not an area we can ignore. I've had the good fortune to spend a fair bit of time with Don Iveson, former mayor of Edmonton this year, and one line he uses quite a bit is, there is no path to a net zero future if we don't adapt along the way. And very much conversely, there is no way to adapt to the degree of changes we can expect if we don't mitigate. But a few of the things that cities can do, and thinking about additional examples to what Donna brought up, one of the first steps that was mentioned was getting that understanding of what do you need to adapt to. The City of Ottawa and the National Capital Area does have a very good set of climate change projections that was done a few years ago. And with that, it's pretty incredible the degree of very small spatial risk mapping that can be done now. And there are groups, for instance, out of the University of Waterloo that can use those maps and overlay it with hazards such as flooding, a degree of urban canopy in the area, which is a very good indicator of heat, things like that, and combine it with indicators of social vulnerability that can be found through StatsCan data for cities to really know where the most vulnerable populations are to really channel investment. A few others is a couple of times a climate lens has been suggested for different programming from a municipality and corporate services. And I really like what a few cities like Windsor and London have done. It is a mandatory component of every council report. So any decision going before council, the staff writing that report need to indicate what are going to be the climate resilience and mitigation implications of that decision. And it's very good approach for just mainstreaming that thinking of every action that a community has, there is some climate tie-in. As Donna mentioned, there are a number of infrastructure decisions that are going to have to be made, including starting to orient in design and procurement, not the climate that we have now, but what is the climate going to look like? What are the operating parameters going to be for closer to the end of the useful design life of that infrastructure? And doing some of that cost benefit analysis of the different options. The City of Vancouver, prior to implementing their Rain City strategy, for instance, took a look at what would be the cost implications of upgrading all of their sewer infrastructure for some of the more frequent and intense atmospheric rivers that they're experiencing. And what they found was they can get a similar level of hazard management from flooding at a 1/10 of the expense, but with really distributed green infrastructure installations across the city, particularly focusing on high-risk areas. So a couple of examples, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Dustin. It's funny when I think you called adaptation the ugly cousin. It reminds me, and it kind of leads into our second question. Often, cities don't get perhaps, the recognition, or maybe the mayor can't cut a ribbon when you're, just doing sewer infrastructure, or even laying down permeable surfaces. And adaptation comes later, right? The benefits to it, aren't always immediate. Not, it's not, in some cases, of course it can be, but mostly, the mitigation is what, will drive politicians often, because they're almost immediate. When you have more trees, when you have cycling lanes, when you have great transit, like the things that help to mitigate against climate. So leads us well into our second question, and that is, how cities can pay for these adaptations. Where does the money come from? And I know that, just in the city of Ottawa, our climate change master plan and our energy evolution plan on mitigation had a very large price tag attached to it. But I guess it just wasn't as well communicated as it needed to be, that wasn't going to be all on the city's property tax base. That was often, shared with other stakeholders, with the community, with residents. It was that the city could do things to catalyze some of that, that investment, but weren't on they weren't, that the 30 billion price tag is not all on the city. So how do we communicate that better, and how do we start to pay for some of this? Maybe I'll start with you on this one, Dustin.
Yeah,
Dustin, can I just interrupt for a moment and remind people that they can put, as we go along, they can put questions in the Q&A, because we will have a period of about 20 minutes or so for questions from the participants. So if people would like to put them in the Q&A, that would be great.
Thanks, Betty.
Yeah, it is definitely the challenge compared to a lot of climate mitigation actions where you can model the business case for it. There's energy paybacks from efficiency or fuel saved, things like that. It's much harder to make the business case for preventing something that you don't want to happen in the first place, especially when you're trying to get any kind of investment in besides strictly public dollars. And it's a few years old now, but FCM with the Insurance Bureau of Canada released a report in 2019, I believe it was, that indicated that a minimum of $5.3 billion of investment was needed every year just at the municipal level to maintain a fairly steady level of risk exposure. And if you're looking at what's happened across Canada this year, the current level of risk is still very high. So yeah, sharing that burden around and actually paying for this, very important. So far, it's typically been government dollars. So through the federal government has been the largest through things like the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and they're currently working on changes for the financing program that kicks in when disaster events occur and reimburse municipalities. They're starting to modify that so changes are proactively build back better improvements, just adapting for future climate. Was really happy to see, personally benefiting from with my current job. With the release of the National Adaptation Strategy, there was a $530 million investment in the Green Municipal Fund for climate adaptation programming for municipalities, and program development for that is currently underway with an intent of launching applications next year. Also, and as a part of that, it's going to be trying to make that business case for more private investment in municipal municipal infrastructure projects. But some of it is going to be also just the money that municipalities already spend. The incremental costs of designing resilient infrastructure, for instance, is very small compared to the overall cost of a project. And typically, business case examples tend to suggest that about every $1 invested in resilient infrastructure can avoid $4 in damage. Mm-hmm. But also to try and get in, there's a lot of purchasing power in private households as well. So I see Steve Winkleman from the Ottawa Climate Action Fund in the chat. He and I have been having a chat where through programs like Better Homes Ottawa, that you can get a loan against the property taxes of a home for a residential energy retrofit. When you're already doing a retrofit, it's a great time to do flood proofing, insulation against heat, depending on where you are, integrating fire smart principles and design, just trying to hit those mitigation and adaptation boxes at the same time, while also leveraging non-public funds over the long term.
Absolutely. I think it is important to remember that, these energy efficiency investments do mean, they do mean cost savings in the end, whether individually or for municipalities. So, yeah. And Donna, any thoughts on how we pay for this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the main points that I'd like to make related to this, like I agree with what Dustin's saying, but I think the reality is we're up against a lot of challenges, and it's going to be very expensive to adapt. And I think there's general recognition that there isn't enough public money to do it. So we are going to need to find ways to get investment from the private sector, whether that's through green bonds or other mechanisms. But I think that the other point that I wanted to make too is that I think that, especially at the local government level where, there's never enough money to do everything, it's really, really important to make strategic decisions. So for example, local governments really can be doing everything they can to not make decisions that lock them into like what I would consider maladaptive development. So for example, urban sprawl is at this point in Canadian cities is an example of maladaptive development. It's not going to help us because it's going to increase our cost of infrastructure and service delivery. And that limits the extent to which we can actually upgrade our existing infrastructure to be adaptive to a changing climate. It's much more costly, and it also it's not proving to be an equitable approach to development either. So I mean, I think for local governments, one way that they can really be making progress is by not making these decisions that are not strategic and that are going to end up costing more in the long run. So we already are going to be stretched in terms of financing adaptation measures. We can't actually be making other decisions that are actually going to exacerbate the problem. So that's one example. The other one that I just wanted to talk a little bit about very quickly is just in terms of the nature-based solutions. Dustin was talking about the Vancouver example in which they kind of learned how much they could leverage nature-based solutions to be able to save money and have efficiencies in service delivery related to their stormwater management. That's really critical too. Like we local governments now are just starting to understand and account for all of the ecosystem services that nature is providing to them, that is really going to help support them in adaptation and support them in managing the costs of service delivery. So that's another way is by leveraging what we already have. So the Insurance Bureau of Canada, in one of their flood risk reports, basically said like the top 3 things we can do to effectively integrate nature-based solutions would be to first protect what we already have. I was really happy to see that Doug Ford reversed his decision on opening up those greenbelt lands to development. The second is, restore what we can, because a lot of restoration is needed as well. And then build what we must. So we just have to start being much more strategic about, the type of infrastructure that we're building.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the sprawl piece as well, because it is maladaptive, as you say, and it also does continue to build inequities in the city and in any municipality, really. I guess recognizing also that sometimes cities, decisions made by local councils aren't always respected by provincial government. So there is, we really still have to hold other levels of government, responsible, as well as we continue to, to look for ways of adapting and mitigating climate change. And this brings us to the third question, and I see some good questions coming up in the Q&A, so I really want to get to them. But we're having these conversations. I'm guessing that most people I know who I've seen come on to this webinar are champions, are people who, like you, who, have been working in this and trying to make that change. And it's sometimes like pushing a boulder up a hill. So what do we do? How do we put pressure on our local municipal representatives? How do so that they are making good decisions, and decisions that will still be a good decision in a year and 10 years from now? What does that look like? What does that look like for you? I feel like I could answer part of this, and maybe I'll jump in later. But what is it that is needed, I guess, and how can we put pressure on local councils? Let either one of you jump in. And I'll put Dustin on the spot.
Okay. Yeah, part of it is, City of Ottawa, for instance, recently wrapped up the consultation of the development of their climate resilience strategy. When those opportunities for public consultation come up, make sure that you are lending your voice to your priorities in this. And another example, I recall your role, Catherine, in really questioning the wisdom of a neighborhood development along the Jock River a few years ago. And it's like, this is right in the floodplain. How does this make sense in a changing climate? And I'm very much a YIMBY person, so coming out against any kind of housing is not a usual thing for me. But similar to what Donna was saying, we have to make sure that we are building the right things in the right places. Big part of it is support effective measure. Another just big component is come election time. Candidates put forward environmental platforms, read them, and make sure that is an important aspect of who is ultimately at that decision-making table.
Absolutely. And I also think that we need to find a way of assisting groups, community associations, even individuals, in doing that. It's not easy. It's not easy as a community group or an organization to really pay attention, to understand what the significance of decisions have been, from elected officials. I really think that there's work to be done there. So maybe that's another webinar for another organization sometime. What do you think, Donna? How do we put pressure on councils?
Yeah, I think that, interestingly, like back to the town of Pelham's 5 buckets. I mean, I think that community groups and citizens who are already aware of the challenge and who are really wanting to see more progress with adaptation, one of the best things that they can do is more of that public awareness and engagement at the neighborhood level. Like I see the amazing work being done by groups like Ecology Ottawa and the cafes, communities, associations for environmental sustainability, where they're really out there supporting with this awareness raising about, for example, pollinator gardens and tree planting, and also trying to hold local government to account on the big pieces. I would say where the pressure comes in, it's basically, I think making sure that council is aware of whether or not they've done their due diligence in making a decision is really, really critical. Because, you know, ultimately they're also getting information from staff. And so I think community groups can be really helpful when they're on top of the information that's been provided to council and help them do their due diligence. And also, again, like, you know, with that, it has to be really strategic. Like the big, I think it's really focusing on the big stuff. Like there was a lot of movement around trying to hold back the urban boundary expansion with the city of Ottawa, you know, to no avail, unfortunately. But that comes back to my point about the community awareness and engagement, because politicians are only going to act when the community is demanding that they're going to act, and when they know there's public support for it. I mean, there's also, I mean, councillors and mayors who are leaders and champions. So I don't want to sort of disregard that. But I think at the end of the day, you know, the more people can get involved and learn and know what are the little things they can do, the better, especially because with adaptation, you know, it's often about people protecting their own property and their homes and being resilient to those, you know, extremes that we're facing. So a lot of the action actually has to happen like by people, you know, in their homes for them to be protected. So.
Yeah, I'll add one point to that. Really, really excellent aspect of the like local organizations and the due diligence in making sure also that the voices that council is hearing and staff are hearing are also reflective of the people who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It's very much the case that people who are in my situation, comparatively privileged, are the ones that staff more often hear from. So making sure the city is doing dedicated outreach to organizations that work with vulnerable populations, or having dedicated outreach or policies around honorariums for participation in focus groups and the like, to really get that perspective of people with lived experience is a very important aspect to make sure that priorities are not reflective of people with inherent levels of higher personal resilience.
Absolutely. And I might add just a couple of things that I try to, you know, suggest. One is that we can work with staff, right? Like there are staff in our municipalities, probably in that kind of, you know, middle management or, you know, range, where they have so much expertise. They care very deeply about what they're doing. And I often tell people, or at least I did when I was on council, that, you know, if you can get into staff and make, you know, make your pitch with staff and to work with staff and to drive that change up to council, that's often more effective than someone trying to drive it into the bureaucracy from say council. So really, you know, really keeping in mind who the staff people. I know, you know, again, I'll refer to the City of Ottawa as what I know, but you know, in our you know, in our climate department, we really do have very strong allies. Also, it really is important to know, you know, who you're speaking to. And I tell people, you know, it really depends on who's coming to talk to you. If it's, you know, if I'm an elected official and somebody who's never agreed with anything and is at odds with me and doesn't live in my ward, perhaps comes alone, you know, or sends a message, not sure how, you know, how serious you take it. But if it's people that I'm aligned with, people whose opinion I care about, people, you know, who, whether it's groups or individuals who I've worked with in the past, you know, deliver that message, it can be more impactful. So to make sure to, as Dustin says, bring people whose voices aren't always at the table, whose voices need to be at the table. It's so important, and to make sure that you are putting pressure on elected officials, because it does have to matter. At least every 4 years it has to matter, but it should, the right people are talking to them. It should all the time. So I'm going to go into the Q&As. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&As. I'm a stickler for ending on time. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. The first one I did see come up, and the state of California is going after oil and gas companies for damages. Is that a possibility for municipalities here in Canada? Maybe who would like to, what do you think, Dustin?
I've seen similar lawsuits launched. I believe Seattle has done so. Really, time will tell whether our legal systems will be able to hold these companies to account. But I think California being the largest jurisdiction so far to launch something like this, and the immense legal power behind that state, could set a very interesting precedent.
Yeah, I agree. Donna, maybe I'll give you the next one. From Gail Greer, local public infrastructure banks. Whoops, I lost it. Being considered as part of the financing solution for municipalities. Do you know if that's happening? Maybe you were with FCM, so you do have
I haven't, that's another thing. I also worked for FCM for about 15 years, also for the Green Municipal Fund for the last half of that time. And I haven't actually seen anything like that. I mean, there are some local governments that have developed revolving green loan funds on their own, where they have, a bucket of money and they invest in green infrastructure projects using that money. So that's one of the financing mechanisms that I've heard used in some local governments in Canada. Other than that, no, I don't know. Dustin, have you heard of local?
I know that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a member of the Climate Proof Canada Coalition. My understanding is that there's interest in playing a greater role in trying to be a leveraging agent for greater private fund participation in adaptation and climate resilience, but I'm not sure to what degree yet they've seen roll out.
But not a bad idea. Okay. What are major impediments to the measures you're proposing? Public attitudes, we have climate deniers, of course, corporate pushback, lack of resources. How does this all fit into what we're trying to do? And just how much are these impediments, stalling our work towards adaptation?
I guess there's different answers to that depending on what the aspect is. Adaptation can be a less politically charged discussion because no one wants their house to flood. So there are some interventions like replacing trunk sewers with something a little bit larger, or more rain gardens, things like that, that really don't have the same degree of pushback compared to the installation of solar panels or electric vehicles, for instance. So mitigate some of that, but there are also some of the most contentious discussions around, for instance, limiting the development of homes along the water, or even more challenging, as we saw on the Quebec side after the 2019 flooding, not allowing rebuilding after flood events. So yeah, the public sentiment can either be favorable, neutral, or highly, highly against, depending on what the intervention is.
And I'll just add, one comment is that I think that sometimes climate change can be so big and overwhelming that it's hard for people to know what to do, how to start. And I think that, you know, on the adaptation side, just one set of resources that I'd like to point out is the Intact Center for Climate Adaptation, which is out of the University of Waterloo, has a whole set of resources for how to deal with, you know, using nature at home, for example, you know, how to protect yourself against wildfires, extreme heat. So they have a whole set. If you Google it, you'll find it. I didn't have the link handy, but I put it in the chat there. But I think that's one of the big barriers is just, you know, it's so overwhelming. People and there are things that can be done at a low cost to start, you know, at a household level, to start to prepare. So helping people with that is really, really important. And then there's all the other bigger pieces that, you know, that need to be done as well.
Absolutely. I did look at that info ahead of the webinar today, and it really is quite interesting. And it does things I learned about, you know, perhaps not having bushes right up to your home, et cetera, if you're in a high risk area for wildfires, but just how you can further flood-proof your home, but for low cost, medium cost, and, you know, getting experts in. So it's really a well worth the look. Intact Center. And somebody, I just want to mention, you know, there's been a couple of comments in the chat. You know, people are suggesting, you know, climate change. Really, we need to start talking about climate crisis and climate chaos. We really have crossed that line into what I would agree with as chaos. I think it's you know, when we're talking about housing, same thing. It really has gotten to a place where it is absolutely alarming. So climate chaos. I'll start to use that. I don't know if either of you have any. Do you still use climate change? Like, I know, I think it was the UN talked about the boiling point, but, you know, what is the language, and should we be using stronger language?
I have seen this argument on both sides. I tend to still use climate change as it's the most reflective of scientific literature, or most commonly used still. But across Canada, we've lost a size of forest larger than Florida through wildfires this year. It was back in June that I saw an estimate that the wildfire smoke over Ontario had cost the health system more than $2 billion. And that kept rolling on for weeks more. So there is definitely a strong case to be made for the much stronger language to be commensurate with the level of risk. It's very unfortunate that when that more reflective language is used, it tends to excite the climate deniers even more.
Point taken. Yeah, go ahead, Donna.
Yeah, if it's okay, I just want to respond to a comment that I just saw in the chat just about, you know, the recommendations from the Intact Center, you know, targeting households is sort of like blaming individuals for the problem. And I just want to say, like, I think that, you know, we actually do, people are going to have to be doing things at the household level. Like that is a reality. And just the one example I'll share is that, like, one of the regional districts that we're working with at the Natural Assets Initiative out in BC is in the process of developing a climate policy right now. And that policy is going to clarify, you know, the climate risks to the community, their responsibilities and liabilities associated with climate change. So it's not going to be possible for local governments to protect every household, for example, those that are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise, for example. There's going to be a point at which, you know, there are going to be policies in place that sort of articulate what a local government will be responsible for and what it won't be. And I think this is the reality, is that particularly with adaptation, we really need to get people aware and understanding what the risks are to their own homes and properties, and we all need to be working together. So it's not a matter of blaming, but it's a matter of we have to actually manage this crisis together, because no government, no level of government alone is going to be able to help everything that's coming our way. We have to kind of face the music that there's some big challenges out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going through the questions. There's one here. I'm gonna answer it from Ricky Stewart. Can you give examples of your experience of effective citizen strategies and influencing municipal policies actions? I'm going to give two very quick ones. One is, and it's a shout out to Ecology Ottawa. Ecology Ottawa did the work on the ground, continues to, goes out, talks to people on their doorstep, gets out of the comfort zone, really, and comes back to council armed with a database, which, politicians are always afraid of other people's databases. So they come back with their own database filled with people across the city who want change. So that is, that is one way of making changes, getting out of our echo chamber and getting, not just echo chamber, but our space where we usually have these conversations. Another one, I think of plant pool at the corner of Somerset and Preston, shut down for almost a decade. We had an entire generation of children in what was then a very low income neighborhood, went without swim lessons. It was boarded up, and it was a group of mostly women who kept it open by going out every single day and making sure that there was a rink, that kids were using the field. They just did that. It was grassroots. So just going back to what Donna was saying, that we do sometimes take that on ourselves, and it can feel unfair, but there is, it is so effective when politicians, when anybody making a decision sees people active and they know that they mean business, and they might even come out and work against you in an election. So I really do think on the ground organizing is key. Okay, we're going to try and get some more questions in here. We've got, probably a couple more minutes. So, that's a tough one. I don't think we'll get through that one in a minute. Sorry. Just as other levels of government may override the decisions of local councils often water down or don't fund or enact the plans that they approved or that city staff suggest. And how do we hold them to account? So I guess that's a wide open one. How do you do it? I mean, I always listen to you. You guys were effective publicly on social media. Does that work? Like, what opportunities and what successes have you seen?
I think, yesterday was a bit of an example of the power of a whole lot of angry people demanding a change in policy. The Greenbelt decision, very much an example. Personally, I am a vocal voice on LinkedIn and Twitter and the like. It's one of my methods, and in my role with FCM, I've had the good fortune of working with a lot of elected officials and municipal staff across the country, and just try and facilitate that knowledge sharing, best practices, aspects like that. And really quickly, I just want to address Suzanne's comment in the chat. Both Donna and I, in our very opening remarks, mentioned the absolute imperative of a net zero future. There is no question whatsoever fossil fuels have to be phased out rapidly. But the situation is that it wasn't done 30 years ago, and we're responding to a climate that is fundamentally changed, and this adaptation discussion has to happen at the same time.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Donna, did you want to add to that? Yeah.
You know, so the question being like how to actually hold local governments to account.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's really tough. I agree. Like you just have to keep, I think, putting the evidence and, be sort of supporting a risk-based evidence approach to decision making, putting, credible information in front of council to consider. It's not always going to be effective. Like there is sometimes that, if the whole community is not aligned and also, rowing in that direction, it's not always effective. But I mean, I think that's the best we can do is continue to build capacity, awareness, bring the latest research and evidence forward. And I just, because we only have a couple of minutes left, one thing that we haven't really talked about, but I think, it's a good example and also goes back to the issue of the fossil fuel issue too, is that I think when we do see, sometimes when there's not policy alignment, between sort of the municipal, regional, provincial, and federal levels, like you can get, policies that are working at cross purposes, and it kind of stifles what local governments can do. So there's just a really good example of, like, in the province of British Columbia. This is more about energy, but they've got a very progressive, what's called an energy step code, where they've got a number of steps that local governments can sort of require their industry to meet in terms of meeting a higher energy efficiency standard. So because of that, some of the local governments in BC are actually now doing things like, for example, the city of Nanaimo has banned natural gas as the primary heating source in new homes beginning in July 2024. I mean, I think that kind of a measure can happen because they've got the policy alignment with the province and the resources, and they've worked within a multi-stakeholder environment with industry to develop that step code. So I can't say enough about sort of, we do need to work at all levels to get the best bang for our buck and impact.
Absolutely. Listen, we've now got 40 seconds left to wrap it up. So there were a lot more questions that we didn't get to. I hope that folks will join in on some of the remainder webinars. Thank you, everyone. It was great to chat with the two of you. I guess if we've learned something is that you really, we can talk adaptation and mitigation. We have to continue to tackle both, right? Like we can't give up. We've got to hit our net zero, or as Donna's early slide showed, you get to a point where you're no longer able to mitigate. We can't let that happen, and as you said, we have to row together, and we have to make sure that we keep that pressure on the people that we elect, the leaders in our community, who we count on to make the right decisions for us and to hold them to account. So on that, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been fun. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks. Great to see such a good turnout.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks, Betty and Catherine and Dustin.
All of you.
Thank you.